Welcome to another episode of our video series of the mechanics of human cognition.
It's great to be here.
How are you doing? I have to say, the material for this one, it really sits with you.
It does. It's heavy stuff, but incredibly important. It forces you to question some of the most basic assumptions we make every single day.
Absolutely. And that's really what we're going to explore today. We're looking right at the heart of human identity and asking, are we fundamentally wired to favor our own group? And maybe more importantly, how do we draw a clear ethical line between that natural loyalty and what becomes real oppression?
That line is everything. I mean, so many public conversations just fall apart because people mix up healthy group identity with actual tangible harm.
Right.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to really move past those simplistic labels. We want to give you a kind of functional ethical toolkit to look at group behavior. And by digging into the psychology of things like xenophobia and modern individualism, we can start to see not just what prejudice is, but why it seems to be such a persistent part of the human story.
Okay, that's a perfect place to start. Let's begin where the confusion often begins, which is with the biology. The whole concept of race as a biological category for humans, the scientific consensus is that it's basically a fiction.
It is. It's the definitive consensus, and it's so important we get this straight right at the top. When you try to apply the biological definition of race, a genetically distinct, isolated subspecies, to Homo sapiens, it just completely falls apart.
And the material we looked at makes this so much clearer by comparing us to the animal kingdom.
Absolutely. I mean, look at dogs. Canis lupus familiaris, they're all one species, but the difference between, say, a Chihuahua and a St. Bernard, that's what a real biological race looks like.
They're so genetically isolated.
Exactly. So isolated that, left to their own devices, they couldn't possibly interbreed and produce the whole spectrum of dog diversity we see. That level of genetic separation is what defines a race in biology. We humans, we don't have anything remotely like that.
It's just amazing when you think about it. Despite all these superficial differences we fixate on, underneath it all, we are remarkably unified genetically.
We are one human family carrying the entire blueprint inside us. There's this really powerful thought experiment. If you took 1,000 people, just 1,000, from any single place on Earth, let's say a small town in Japan or a village in Nigeria, and you put them on a new habitable planet for 50,000 years.
Okay.
Their descendants would eventually express the entire range of human physical diversity, the full spectrum. The genetic potential to produce every feature we see across the globe is already present in every population.
So all those physical traits we've been taught to see as signs of superiority or inferiority, things like athletic ability, body type,
yeah.
They're not signs of merit at all.
Not in the slightest. They are just elegant, localized solutions to ancient environmental problems. They're adaptations. Think about, for example, the incredible lung capacity of some elite long-distance runners from specific regions. That's not some sign of being a better human. It's likely a genetic echo of thousands of years of adaptation to high altitudes, or perhaps the need for endurance running across savannas. It's a specific tool for a specific job. It has absolutely no bearing on a person's intelligence or their moral worth.
Okay, so if biology offers zero foundation for this kind of bias, we have to shift gears completely. If we accept that group preference is natural, maybe even a survival instinct, where does it go wrong? What's the ethical tripwire?
This is, for me, the most powerful and useful part of this whole analysis. It gives us a clear operational definition of racism or communalism that has nothing to do with skin color. It defines it simply as assisting one's community in injustice and oppression.
Wow, that reframes the entire conversation. It moves it away from identity and onto pure behavior.
It does. I mean, think about it. Sticking together, having pride in your country, supporting your local team, that's all perfectly healthy. It's arguably necessary for society to even function.
It's the glue.
It's the glue. The line is crossed the moment you help your group, or, and this is so important, the moment you stay silent, while they are doing something wrong, while they're committing an injustice. Silence is complicity. That's where loyalty becomes oppression. The source material even calls this oppression a kind of spiritual darkness, a covering of the truth.
That's an incredibly potent definition because you can apply it to anything, a corporation, a political movement, even a family.
Precisely. Let's take a big tech company. It could be the most diverse workplace imaginable on paper, people from every background. But if that company is knowingly using exploitative labor, or if its products are used to undermine democracy, or it's causing massive environmental damage, then according to this definition, any employee who actively helps that happen or who just stays quiet and collects their paycheck is participating in oppression. The morality is in the act, not in the demographic makeup of the group doing the acting.
That is a very clear, very functional test. So let's scale this up. Let's go macro. If race doesn't define superiority, what about civilization? We're definitely taught to rank civilizations on a ladder.
Oh, we're absolutely trapped in that way of thinking. A civilization, at its root, is just a group of people who've decided to live by city rules. Meidin, the word's origin rules for culture, for law.
But in the real world, the measure of an advanced civilization is almost always money, military power, consumption.
And that's the great mistake, the core error that this analysis points out. We see tanks and yachts and skyscrapers and we think advanced. But the sources here argue that the real measure of a civilization's superiority isn't what it owns, but its functionality. And even more, its adaptiveness.
That's ability to change itself.
Exactly. Can that society look at its own rules, see they're not working, and then fix them? Can it evolve its own institutions over time? That capacity to self-correct is a far better sign of strength than brute force or wealth.
And if we use that metric, that adaptiveness, the sources are, well, they're pretty brutal about some modern societies, especially the hyper-consumerist model.
They are. The modern American consumption model is basically labeled as primitive, hierarchically backward. And the reasoning is that its entire foundation is built on maximizing human whims, on the endless pursuit of pleasure and material distraction.
Which has a real-world cost.
A catastrophic one. This model creates a footprint, an ecological burden, that the authors argue is more systemically destructive than millions of atomic bombs. It's a civilization that is quite literally eating its own host.
So what's the alternative? What does a superior civilization look like under this more functional or spiritual metric?
Well, the material points to a civilization like that of Indian culture. It's held up as superior not because of its economy, but because of its proven functionality over millennia to generate deep, enduring spiritual and moral frameworks. It's the wellspring for almost every major tradition we have, from spiritual philosophies to physical disciplines. Its value is measured by its ability to shape human consciousness for the better, not its ability to produce consumer grades.
I see. Okay, let's shift back down to the individual, to the psychology. What's driving this hostility in the first place? Where does this automatic dislike of the other come from?
It comes from what you could call the chimpanzee reflex. Xenophobia, that fear of the stranger, is a primal automatic response. It's wired into the oldest, most animal part of our brain. It's a survival script from a much more dangerous time.
And we see this pop up really early in life, don't we?
We do. There are studies showing babies tend to gravitate towards faces that look like their parents or caregivers. It's a simple familiarity bias. But what's really tragic is how society can corrupt this. Children learn to internalize negative stereotypes, sometimes even against their own group. You know those classic doll studies where kids point to the doll that looks like them and call it bad?
So society is basically programming the reflex.
It's giving the reflex a target. But here's the thing. We aren't just chimpanzees. We have this other capacity, reason, akli. Our minds have the incredible ability to find common ground, to build trust and cooperation with people who look and think totally differently from us.
And the failure to use that ability.
That is the very definition of oppression. Oppression means to cover the truth, to live in darkness. And you do that every time you let the primal fear of the chimpanzee reflex override your rational human mind.
This idea of oppression as a failure of reason seems to really apply to huge political issues, like immigration. The sources argue that the two extremes, just open the doors completely or build a giant wall, are both forms of oppression.
Because they're both lazy, wholesale answers. They're failures of reason. Total unfiltered acceptance ignores real-world constraints and legitimate concerns about resources and social cohesion. That's a form of denial. But total rejection is also a denial of human potential, of mutual benefit, of shared humanity.
So a rational approach would be something in the middle. A smart system.
A rational approach demands an intelligent filter, a process for understanding who is coming, why they are coming, what they can contribute, and what they need. It's about maximizing mutual benefit.
But even that can become oppressive, right, if it's purely about what we can get from them.
Oh, absolutely. If your smart system is just about cherry-picking the best human resources, taking the doctors and engineers and leaving everyone else behind, then you're just engaging in a sophisticated form of exploitation. You're treating people like assets, not human beings. Again, it's a failure to engage with the full, complex truth of the situation. That is oppression.
So what happens to a society's reason, to that higher capacity, when it feels like its very survival is at stake?
It shuts down. When a society is facing, say, a deep economic collapse or massive resource shortages, what some would call a survival problem, it undergoes what psychologists call regression. It psychologically regresses.
It goes back to its animal state.
It goes right back to the chimpanzee reflex. The higher functions go offline and fear takes over. And that is a very, very short road to authoritarianism and fascism.
There's a really sharp point made about how societies with a high standard of living are actually more vulnerable to this.
It's a terrifying paradox. You take a privileged society, one that's used to comfort and stability, and you suddenly pull the rug out from under them. The psychological collapse is far more brutal and violent than in a society that's already accustomed to hardship. The analogy is almost like The Walking Dead. The well-meaning suburban dad who has never known real struggle, he becomes the most dangerous person in the room when the lights go out. His shock turns directly into a primal me-first survivalism.
And that fear isn't just happening naturally. It feels like it's being cultivated. Particularly with this media obsession with extreme individualism. Why is pushing isolation on people a good investment for the system?
Because it creates the perfect consumer. Look, we are fundamentally social creatures. We need connection to feel whole. When you force people into isolation, into hyper-individualism, they feel weak, fragile, and empty inside.
And they need to fill that emptiness with something.
And the system is right there, telling them the only way to fill that void is to consume, to buy things, to distract yourself, to work constantly so you can afford to buy more things to distract yourself. It creates these perpetually working, perpetually consuming zombies who are too tired and too disconnected to ever challenge the system itself.
It's like the system gives you a painkiller instead of letting the wound heal.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's an analgesic civilization. It actively attacks what you could call our 5 factory settings for being a healthy human. Diet, movement, stress, relationships, and a spiritual life. And the relationship part is key. If the culture is constantly telling you to cut ties with your own family, cut out toxic parents at the first sign of conflict, how on earth are you supposed to develop the psychological muscles needed to accept and build bridges with total strangers from another culture? You can't. Your capacity for deep connection has atrophied.
So we need to draw a really clear line for everyone listening. There's a huge difference between being an individual and being forced into individualism.
This is the absolute crux of it. Being a true individual means understanding yourself, your needs, your values, within the context of a community. It's about self-knowledge and strength. But forced individualism is a counterfeit. It's a trick. It's a system that sells you conformity disguised as uniqueness.
Like everyone getting the same unique tattoo.
Yeah, exactly. You think you're rebelling, but you're just participating in a trend marketed to millions, choosing true, authentic individuality in a world that profits from your isolation. That's maybe the hardest and most revolutionary choice you can make.
That's a powerful framework. So to bring it all together, we've seen that biological race is an artificial construct. We found a clear ethical line between healthy group loyalty and actual oppression. And we've seen how fear and forced isolation are used to trigger our worst, most primal reflexes, shutting down our ability to reason.
And it all comes back to that one central point. The failure to use reason, that higher, uniquely human capacity, is the true source of all oppression. When we let the chimpanzee reflex run the show, whether it's in our personal lives or our national policies, we do a profound injustice to ourselves and to everyone else.
So a final thought for you to take away. If this forced individualism we've been talking about is in fact a deliberate strategy to create isolated consumers, then what might be the most powerful act of resistance? Perhaps it's intentionally building strong, local, non-consumerist communities. That might just be the best defense we have against societal regression and the xenophobia that always comes with it. Thank you so much for this analysis.
It was my pleasure, a crucial conversation to have.